Good morning. Esteemed guests, authorities, and participants, welcome. At this moment, we're starting the 22nd International Congress of Aesthetics. We would like to invite to join today's opening ceremony the President of Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, Professor Sandra Regina Goulart Almeida. The Dean of the Faculty of Human Sciences and Philosophy of the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, Professor Bruno Vanderlei Reis. The Head of the Philosophy Department of the Faculty of Human Sciences and Philosophy of Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, Professor André Jofili Abad. The President of the Organizing Committee of the 22nd International Congress of Aesthetics and of the International Association of Aesthetics, Professor Rodrigo Duarte. The President of the Brazilian Association of Aesthetics and member of the Philosophy Department of the Federal University of Ouro Preto, Professor Cíntia Vieira da Silva. We would like to invite the President of Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, Professor Sandra Regina Goulart Almeida, to this event's opening speech.
Bom dia a todos e todas. Good morning. It's a pleasure. O som está um probleminha no som. Just a minute, please. Melhorou. Let's try again. Can you hear me? Pode falar? Okay. They tell me I should go on. So let's start over again. So, bom dia a todos e todas. Good morning. As the current rector, president of Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, and also a professor of literature, it's a pleasure and also an honor to open the 22nd International Congress of Aesthetics here in our university. I would like, first of all, to thank Professor Rodrigo Duarte, the president of the organizing committee, for the invitation. And on his behalf, I thank all the people who worked so hard for the success of this event. I would also like to greet Professor Bruno Reis, the Dean of the Faculty of Human Science and Philosophy, and also Professor André Abad, Head of the Department of Philosophy. So thank you very much for organizing the event, and thank you very much for inviting me to be here. And a special welcome to Professor Cíntia Vieira da Silva, President of the Brazilian Association of Aesthetics, on behalf of whom I greet all the people that are here participating in this important conference. Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais is very proud of hosting this event. As you probably know, we are a federally funded public university, one of the best in the country, known for its commitment to quality education and also for its relevance to society. We are very happy to have you all here with us today, especially after the difficult pandemic times went through for the past years. So Professor Rodrigo Duarte was telling me that this Congress was initially planned to take place in 2022, but because of the pandemic, it was postponed like many things in our lives. So for this reason, we are very happy to have you here in presence, being able to congregate people to think about such important matters as this Congress is going to address. And this Congress happens in a very special time for us. After going through the pandemic in one of the most difficult times for us as a public institution, and also as a nation, I would say, we start 2023 in a hopeful tone. Hope to take back democracy and civility, and the belief in science and the institutions such as ours, against barbarism, negationism, authoritarianism, and obscurantism that we had to fight over the past years. And the culture and the arts, central themes of this event, and so dear to my heart, are the means through which we manage to give voice and visibility to acts of resistance, something that we had to do very often over the past years, because as we know, the aesthetic field is also the field of resistance, the field of critical thinking and reflection, and of construction of alternative world views. Likewise, the university, especially a public university like ours, is the locus of confluence of these resistances, of the unconditional defense of democracy and freedom of speech. The hopeful tone I mentioned in the beginning refers to the fact that I do believe, and I want to believe, we are on a civilizing path of a society that cultivates democracy, freedom, peace, the common good. So the hope, I'm going to, okay. So the hopeful tone I mentioned before refers to the fact that I believe, and I want to believe, that we as a society, we are on a civilizing path of a society that cultivates democracy, freedom, peace, the common good, that respects diversity, difference, and the plurality of knowledges in peoples. Ailton Krenak, a Brazilian indigenous leader and writer, said to us in a talk here in the university in the beginning of the pandemic that we would have to come out of the pandemic differently. We would have to have learned something from the terrible experience we were facing then. We would have to learn to act differently as people, as institutions, and as countries, to privilege collaboration and solidarity among peoples. In a way, this is what I think this meeting is about: collaboration, solidarity, ethical responsibility towards others, and critical thinking, which is also coincides with the mission of a university such as ours. And I am confident that this Congress will greatly contribute to make us think about our responsibilities in this world, and about our future as nations and humans. I wish you have a pleasant time while in our university, in our city, and also in our country from those who come from abroad. Hope you enjoy our cuisine. We are very proud of our cuisine. Our history, you know, we are famous for the history, not always a pleasant history, but it's very important to know, to learn, not to forget, and our hospitality. And again, I'm also very happy to have you here with us, and I will welcome everybody and hope you also enjoy our campus. Despite the difficulties we went through in the past years, we kept our campus and our community together and organized so that we would have a chance to meet people like you who come here to help us think about the world in the future, and also to help us construct a better society and a better institution such as ours. So thank you very much for being here. Welcome everybody, and thank you again for the organizers for the invitation to be here. And sorry about the problems with the sound. I hope you're able to understand what I said. Thank you very much. So now I pass the word to Professor Bruno Reis.
Thank you, Sandra. I'll be very brief. After your words, I have not much to add. I'd like just to thank you all for coming from abroad. I'm very glad and honored with the presence of you all and the realization of the ICA here at the Federal University of Minas Gerais, and specifically FAFISH, and especially after so many delays. I'm sure it wasn't easy for anybody, but it was especially difficult and hard for Rodrigo to have to accomplish all this smoothly as it would be possible in such hard circumstances. So, welcome. Have a very pleasant and productive day. We're here at the directorship of the faculty. We'll be glad to help in any ways, and we apologize for any inconvenience. Thank you all. Professor Rodrigo Duarte.
Bom dia a todos e todas. Welcome everybody. As head of department of philosophy, I'd like to welcome you to Belo Horizonte and to the Federal University of Minas Gerais. It's a pleasure to be here alongside Sandra, Rodrigo, Bruno, and Cynthia. And I'd like to congratulate the organizing committee, Rodrigo, and everyone who is helping. I thank a lot for appreciate your hard work. This is also an opportunity to celebrate Rodrigo's life and work, given that Rodrigo is retiring from our department in the next few weeks. So this amazing event is also an opportunity to celebrate Rodrigo's work. Rodrigo has been with us for 33 years, and so we should also thank him for everything he has given to this university and to this faculty. So, welcome everyone. I hope you have an amazing week and enjoy Belo Horizonte with its cuisine, drinks, and, and everything it has to offer. Thank you and welcome.
Good morning, everybody. And the Brazilian Association of Aesthetics is very pleased to have supported the organization of the ICA. And, well, I think we will have a very joyful and busy week. And I welcome everybody.
I'll pass the word now to Rodrigo. They didn't tell me that he's going to retire, okay? I have to sign, so think about it.
Thank you, Sandra. So, good morning, everybody. On behalf of Clarity, I'm going to read a small text I've written for this occasion. Dear President of the Federal University of Minas Gerais, Professor Sandra Regina Goulart Almeida, dear Director of the Faculty of Human Science and Philosophy, Professor Bruno Vanderlei Reis, dear Head of the Philosophy Department, Professor André Joffeli Abad, dear President of the Brazilian Society of Aesthetics and Philosophy of Art, Professor Cynthia Vieira da Silva, dear members of the IAA Executive Committee, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to speak to you this morning to warmly welcome you at the official opening of the 22nd International Congress of Aesthetics. This event is the culmination of an enormous collective effort effort that began in 2019 in Belgrade, when I talked to Miško Suvaković, former IAA president, for the first time about organizing the next ICA in Belo Horizonte, having had from him prompt and enthusiastic support. The agenda was interrupted by the COVID-19 pandemic, which led us to difficult decisions, the hardest of which was to postpone the realization of this Congress, initially planned for July 2022, for a year. I should like to take this opportunity to express my appreciation to all people and institutions who contributed to making this Congress happen, with preeminence to the outstanding organizing committee. I ask the people of the organizing committee to stand up, please. Yeah. Whose executive coordinator was Dr. Rizia Rocha, and also composed by Dr. Ana Luisa Colli, Professor Miguel Galli, Fernanda Proença, and Juliana Santos Pereira. I also thank the members of the ICA22 Scientific Board, which were very helpful in the decisive moments of the organizing process of the event. The Congress could not exist without the essential support of the Federal University of Minas Gerais, especially from its presidency in the person of Professor Sandra Regina Goulart Almeida, and the Dean of Cultural Affairs, Fernando Mencarelli, who is here. Thank you, Fernando. Yeah, the Faculty for Human Sciences and Philosophy Director, Professor Bruno Vanderlei Reis, the head of the Philosophy Department, Professor André Abad, and the Graduate Studies Program in Philosophy, adhered to the project from the beginning, for which I sincerely thank them. Material financial support was granted by the federal agency CNPq and the state foundation FAPEMIG. We are honored to welcome participants from Australia, Austria, Canada, China, Czech Republic, England, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, Korea, Lithuania, Mexico, Netherlands, Peru, Poland, Russia, Serbia, Slovakia, Slovenia, Sweden, Turkey, Uruguay, and USA. And of course, those who came from all regions of Brazil. We know of the difficulties many of you had to overcome to be here today, and are grateful for the effort to join us in discussing crucial issues in contemporary aesthetics in a moment where the world observes international conflicts with growing concern. It's essential to stress the relevance of art and culture as means to bring people together in the highest interests of humankind. Therefore, in the name of the local organizing committee, I express our most sincere wish that the discussions resulting from this week will positively contribute to the consolidation of the International Association for Aesthetics aims. Thank you very much.
With that, the Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais declares the opening ceremony of the 22nd International Congress of Aesthetics closed. Thank you, and let us now proceed to the sessions and events of the conference. Thank you.
Hi everyone, just want to let you know that we will start in a few moments. There has been a slight change in the program, so Rodrigo Duarte will be speaking first because he's here in person, and then after him we'll have Mishko and then Marilena Chauí through video conference. Okay, just a few moments of your patience and we'll start shortly.
my name is Miguel Gali. I will help in moderating this main session. We will have Misko Subakovic from Serbia, the University of Arts in Belgrade, here online. Also online, Marilena Chauí, professor at University of São Paulo. And opening with the lecture of Rodrigo Duarte, Oswald de Andrade's Anthropophagy. So,
thank you, Miguel. It's better that I do a sign. Yeah, okay. So, I'm going to read my paper. Oswald de Andrade was a Brazilian poet, novelist, dramatist, philosopher, and journalist co-responsible for the Modern Art Week of São Paulo in 1922. Next slide, please. Which introduced in Brazil the renewed artistic language of the European avant-garde from the beginning of the 20th century. Andrade stood out from the group of modernist artists as one of the most unpied and perhaps the most identified with the transgression coming from the various isms of the European Cultural Revolution at the beginning of the 20th century. Benedito Nunes, one of Oswald de Andrade's best interprets, said about him, I quote, with his theoretical impatience and particular thirst for the new and the novelty, he was among our modernists the one who most intimately took communion from the restless spirit of the European avant-garde, unquote. Andrade admired the European avant-garde artists at a distance until 1923, when he and his freshly married wife, the painter Tarsila do Amaral, went to Paris, where they met some of the most significant artists of the period. After these encounters, Oswald de Andrade started both a friendship and an intellectual cooperation with the Swiss avant-gardist poet Blaise Sandra. Alexandre Eulálio, who studied Sandra's contacts with Brazilian artists and his activities in the cultural milieu of the country, described Oswald de Andrade's acquaintances in Paris and his approximation to the Swiss poet as follows. I quote, next slide, please. Oswald de Andrade, the most exuberant and extroverted of the group, seeks to meet directly Sandra and other celebrities whom the group admired and desired to meet in flesh and bone. Jules Roman, Picasso, Jean Cocteau, Leger, Brancusi, personalities with whom they had amicable, although superficial relations. Sandra will be the only great artist with whom the ties tightened and turned into a mutual friendship. Next slide, please. The continuity of the friendship that began in 1923 in Paris occurred in Brazil, where Sandra was invited by Paulo Prado, a mix of intellectual and businessmen who had been one of the most important sponsors of the 1922 Modern Art Week, and who was interested in deepening the interchange between Brazilian modernists and European avant-garde artists. One of the most relevant results of Sandra's visit to Brazil in 1924 was that he taught Brazilian artists to look with brand new eyes at some until then underestimated cultural phenomena of the country, like the Carnival in Rio and and the Baroque towns of Minas Gerais, Ouro Preto, Tiradentes, Sabará, etc. The renewed consideration of these phenomena led to the overcoming of prejudices against both popular culture and the artistic heritage of Brazil's colonial past. The immediate impact of this on Andrade was the composition of his poetry book. The two next slides, please. Poesia Pau-Brasil Poetry, Brazilwood Poetry, in which the perceptible elements of the Brazilian daily life are rescued from their former insignificance and raised to the condition of poetic matter. The book was published in 1924, the same year of the publication of one of Oswaldo de Andrade's two famous manifestos, the Manifesto of Pau-Brasil Poetry. The impact of Blaise Cendra's eccentric position, sympathetic towards non-European peoples, on this phase of Oswaldo de Andrade's intellectual production can be felt in one passage of his first manifesto, in which there is an explicit mention of the Swiss writer. I quote, a suggestion of Blaise Cendra's. You have the train loaded, ready to leave. A black man turns the crank of the turntable beneath you. The slightest carelessness and you will live in the opposite direction to your destination. End of quote. The Manifesto of Pau-Brasil Poetry, which could be read as an ideological companion to its correlated book of poems, thus claimed the reversion of the century-long role played by Brazil as an exporter of raw material to foreign industries and importer of European cultural goods. Instead, according to this manifesto, the country's culture could also provide export items. Furthermore, it's also outstanding here that for Oswaldo de Andrade, Brazil, if correctly seen by his compatriots, could be understood by the rest of the world as a perfect synthesis of the most modern features of contemporary Western cultures and the elements of the wholly untouched natural environment. I quote, next slide, please. Merely Brazilians of our time, the necessary of chemistry, mechanics, economy, and ballistics. Everything assimilated, without cultural meetings, practical, experimental, poets, without bookish reminiscences, without supporting comparisons, without ontology. Barbarous, credulous, picturesque, and tender, readers of newspapers. Pau-Brasil, the forest and the school, the National Museum, cuisine, art and dance, vegetation, Pau-Brasil. End of quote. The final part of the Manifesto of Pau-Brasil Poetry was the base for Oswaldo de Andrade's second and much more edgy ideological statement associated with his literary creation, the Anthropophagus Manifesto from 1928, which inaugurated the anthropophagic phase of his intellectual activities. Next slide, please. The anthropophagic phase of his intellectual activities. The idea of the connection between avant-garde art and human-eating native people was not at that time properly new. Francis Picabia had already published his, next slide please, his Manifeste Cannibale, which first appeared in Dada #7, Dadaphone, in March of 1920. Furthermore, the same Picabia published still in 1920 the two-issue Dadaist magazine Cannibal, in which there is a collection of aphorisms by various artists linked to the French Dada movement. Okay. Contrasting with Picabia's statement of this kind, in which cannibalism was highly and metaphorically alluded to and very abstractly conceived, in the short story book Gli amori futuristi, programmi di vita con variante a scelta, Futurist Loves, Life Programs with Variants of Your Choice, published in 1922 by the founder of the Futurism, Filippo Tomasi Marinetti, references to cannibalism are explicit. In this book, there are at least 3 short stories displaying crude scenes of people having been eaten. One of these, Il Negro, the Black Man, is a terrible racist narrative in which an Afro-American is the victim of cannibalism perpetrated by a bored white woman who had savage sex with him before she ate his flesh. Also in La Guancia, the Chick, a couple's exacerbated sexuality culminates with a scene of vampirism in which the woman drinks her partner's blood. Finally, in La Carne Congelata, the Frozen Flesh, a soldier brings the salted corpse of his beloved to the war, where he eats her flesh piece by piece. Besides Picabia's and Marinetti's cannibalistic approach, one could look back even to Apollinaire's Calligramme, whose poem Sur les prophéties, on the prophecies, explicitly refers to a case of cannibalism in Oceania. I think the 2 further slides, please. Yeah. Have you Cannibal? The next one. Yeah. Gli amori futuristi. And then, okay, Calligramme. Nevertheless, concerning the direct influence of the cannibalistic approaches by the European avant-garde on Oswald de Andrade, the same Blaise Cendrars, whose intervention was decisive to the writing of Pau-Brasil poetry, appears as another author also interested in the phenomenon of human eating, especially in his Anthologie Nègre. Next slide, please. There are plenty of references to cannibalism. Indeed, among the 108 short narratives collected from many African tribal societies, Subiria, Vassoro, Bakalong, Peul, and Sonique, among others, there are many tales in which people are eaten either by other humans or animals or even anthropomorphic vegetal beings. It is uncertain whether getting familiar with this exciting material from African tales drove Cendrars in the opposite direction to his destination. However, it certainly strengthened Oswald de Andrade's interest in Brazil's non-European cultural heritage. Benedito Nunes states, however, that it would be a mistake not to acknowledge the originality of Andrade's literary production and his essential contribution to the self-assurance of the founders of an authentic Brazilian modernist culture. Next slide, please. We accept the main facts of the Oswaldian intellectual itinerary and disagree with the interpretation according to which the 1928 anthropophagy reduces itself to the matrix of European cannibalism. The culinary erotic model of Marinetti's novels, and the aggressive anti-bourgeois model of Picabia's Cannibal Manifesto, and that, therefore, Oswald de Andrade would present himself as a disseminator of certain European experimentalisms in what regards the function of his work in the modernist movement's process. End of quote. The most striking reason for Nunes' position is that, differently from European avant-garde artists who had to look for cannibalistic inspiration as an oppositional attitude against the bourgeois values of Western societies in very distant cultural environments, such as the African continent, Oswald de Andrade had only to look back at the ritual practices of the Brazilian or Aboriginal peoples, which included the ingestion of the flesh of their enemies, also in the hope that the winners of a tribal war would assimilate their good qualities. Aiming at inspiration for a project of an authentic Brazilian culture, Oswald de Andrade proposed that the cases in which Brazilian indigenous ate white European colonizers could be metaphorically understood as an operation of both confronting their oppressive and violent actions in Brazil and also the opportunity to assimilate their qualities that could be useful for the Aboriginal own purposes. According to the proposed metaphor, Oswald de Andrade stated that Brazilian cultural producers should swallow some contents of foreign cultures and merge the best of them with topics of autochthonic production to yield brand new cultural goods that would fulfill both the avant-garde claim of innovation and the need to establish a genuinely Brazilian contemporary artistic production. The following passage of the Anthropophagus Manifesto shows both the paractactic style of Oswald de Andrade's writing and his purpose of appropriating psychoanalytic concepts like sublimation and taboo to emphasize the intended qualities of a life free from the diseases of civilization. Next slide, please. The struggle between what one might call uncreated and the creature, illustrated by the permanent contradiction of man and his taboo, daily love and capitalist modus vivendi, anthropophagy, absorption of the sacred enemy, to turn him into totem, the human adventure, the earthly finality. However, only the pure elites managed to realize carnal anthropophagy, which carries inside the highest meaning of life and averts all the ills identified by Freud, the ills of catechism. What happens is not a sublimation of sexual instinct. It is the thermometric scale of anthropophagic instinct. Once carnal, it turns elective and creates friendship. If effective, love. If speculative, science. It deviates, it transfers itself. We reach vivification. The low anthropophagy merged into the scenes of catechism, envy, usury, calumny, murder, plague of the so-called cultured and Christianized nations. That is what we're acting against, anthropophagy. End of quote. What Andrade means by the struggle between what one might call uncreated and the creature refers to the basic dilemma of human beings facing their finitude towards divinity and the pre-existing world. which can be translated into the meaning of the permanent contradiction of man and his taboo as well. Andrade would see a contradiction also between daily love and capitalist modus vivendi, referring to the reified way of life in capitalist society as opposed to the potentiality of a rich, affective life. Moreover, according to anthropophagic viewpoint, enemies are sacred, since conflict always implies a relationship of recognition in the Hegelian sense, which, in the case of anthropophagy, leads to the need to devour the contenders to absorb their qualities. This passage also enunciates one of the most important cultural, mental, and political procedures of anthropophagy, to turn taboos into totems, meaning the liberation of what was repressed and subterranean, thus overcoming the arrogance of the Western world towards the rest of the planet. On the other hand, carnal anthropophagy, containing the highest meaning of life and confronting the ills of catechism, means a kind of desublimation that only the pure elites, meaning the chiefs of aboriginals, could realize. Furthermore, what Andrade calls the thermometric scale of anthropophagic instinct points to the several levels of sociability and culture which could be enhanced in a society ruled by the principles of anthropophagy: friendship, love, and science. The crisis of the coffee economy after the international economic breakdown at the end of the 20s also coincided with the repositioning of the Brazilian modernist artists who had been united at the beginning of the decade around the renewal of the country's culture in opposite ideological fields. Consequently, Oswald de Andrade approached the left wing and joined the Brazilian Communist Party in 1931. All of Andrade's activities as a journalist and writer in this decade turned more and more political in a traditional sense, and he tends to take some distance from the modernistic and avant-garde position assumed at the beginning of the 20s. In the late 40s and beginning of the 50s, however, without leaving the left-wing position taken on some years before, he resumed the idea of cultural anthropophagy, attempting to turn it further political in a different way. His project from then on was to establish it as a broader Weltanschauung, covering not only artistic matters but also political, ideological, and philosophical viewpoints. Since then, he nourished the project of becoming the founder of an anthropophagical philosophy that would have as sources not only Marxist, Nietzschean, and Freudian viewpoints, but also the inspiration of Brazilian Aboriginal practices and cosmovision. Among the two works of the early 50s, which are especially significant concerning Andrade's convictions of that time, The Crisis of Messianic Philosophy, and next slide, please. And the March of the Utopias. The former can be considered the main inheritor of the anthropophagy project. Already in the beginning of The Crisis of Messianic Philosophy, Andrade proposes a differentiation between cannibalism and anthropophagy. While the former is the mere act of eating human flesh, either for greed or for need. The latter is associated with ritual practice of ancestors, through which, as already mentioned, the qualities of the eaten entity are absorbed by their eaters. Another characteristic trait of Andrade's concept of anthropophagy displayed in this work is its inextricable association with matriarchy. I quote, "Everything is linked to the existence of two cultural hemispheres which divided history into matriarchy and patriarchy. The former is the world of primitive man, the latter of the civilized. The former produced an anthropophagic culture, the latter a messianic one." End of quote. Andrade's model of cultural anthropophagy incorporated Marx's thought as a heritage of the previous communist activism, enriched with Nietzsche's cultural critique and psychoanalytical topics coming directly from his reading of Freud's writing on psychosocial matters such as Totem taboo and civilization and its discontents, among others. For Andrade, while patriarchy, when analyzed under the light of Marxism, is above all a typical feature of class societies, matriarchy is a type of human sociability that predominated in the remote past of humankind, was a spontaneous form of communism, which, considered from a Freudian viewpoint, was freed of all neuroses that infest civilized people. From Nietzsche, Andrade took his relentless criticism of the slave's moral and the prevalence of the power of the sacerdotal caste throughout the history of civilization, associating it immediately with patriarchy. Nevertheless, looking back to the etymology of the words related to the adjective priestly, sacerdotal in Portuguese, Andrade realizes that it is composed of the Latin words sacred, and otium, leisure time, pointing to the fact that priests have been the social layer which was not submitted to exhausting labor, having had enough time to do what they liked to do. This indicates that when otium should be no longer sacred or priestly, it could be a sign of freedom. It also points out that a new liberating form of leisure could emerge after patriarchy and priesthood is overcome. According to Andrade, next slide please, in the super technicized world that announces itself when the final barriers of patriarchy fall, human beings will be able to fatten up their innate laziness, mother of fantasy, invention, and love. Moreover, at the end of their prolonged state of negativity, they could give back to themselves in the final synthesis between techniques, which is civilization, and natural life, which is culture, their plain instinct. Over the Faber, the Viator, and the Sapiens, the Homo ludens will then prevail. They were calmly looking forward to devouring the planet, but the imperative of its cosmic destination. End of quote. The reference to the Homo ludens, the title of the book originally published in 1938 by Johann Huizinga, is remarkable since it points out the relevance of the play element in culture and society, and it has something to do with Andrade's relentless critique of the priesthood, as already mentioned, due to the Nietzschean inspiration. The criticism is also directed to Socrates as a paradigm of seriousness linked to the obedience to the powers to be. I quote, "He, Socrates, represents the loss of the playful trait in the developed human being." End of quote. However, this is not something less relevant for Andrade's anthropophagic utopia, since he blames the real socialism of his time to having firmly incorporated some Socratic elements instead of gradually stepping into a new and more exuberant sociability form. His point is that the socialism implanted in the Soviet Union was a continuation of patriarchy, having distanced itself from the idea of establishing a new matriarchy in which there would be a synthesis of the technological development accomplished during millennia of messianic patriarchal domination with the spontaneous communism of prehistory marked by the prevalence of women. Thus, in an anthropophagic society, considering human beings' existential position as finite and naturally deprived creatures, aesthetic phenomena should be a vital part of their social and cultural life. As Andrade puts it, I quote, "The human being is the animal who lives between two big toys, love, where he wins, death, where he loses." Because of this, he invented the visual arts, the poetry, the dance, the music, the theater, the circus, and finally the movies. End of quote. It is remarkable that in the march of the utopias, next slide please, contrasting with the crisis of messianic philosophy, anthropophagy is barely explicitly mentioned. However, it resounds continuously, quietly in the background. Andrade's focus was then the crucial confrontation from the 15th century between Reformation and Counter-Reform, whose culmination for him was the expulsion of the Netherlanders from northeastern Brazil in the 17th century. For Andrade, the matriarchal heritage of the Brazilian contenders, which included not only white people of Portuguese ascendancy, but also Afro-Brazilians and Aboriginals, was decisive for the victory over the strongly armed and very well-trained Netherlanders. I quote, next slide please. "In the Dutch War, a playful and lovely way of life won against an utilitarian and business-like concept. Brazil was composed of matriarchal races, which were not distant from the libertarian standpoints of Plato, More, and Campanella's dreams. It was leisure time, otium, facing business, negocium. Leisure time beat the rough and long Flemish conquest based on the first profit and initial rising of the bourgeoisie." End of quote. With the mention of the Renaissance utopists, Andrade draws attention to the impact of the discovery of Brazil by the Portuguese at the beginning of the 15th century, which inspired the British Thomas More to formulate his utopia, whose narrative would be based on the report of a certain Raphael Haitlodeus, who supposedly was one of the 24 men left by Américo Vespúcio in Cabo Frio, northern of Rio de Janeiro. Another case of Brazilian influence in the European foresight of a better world is, according to Andrade, Michel de Montaigne essay De Cannibale, in which the author reported from, I quote, a man, I quote from Montaigne, a man who had lived 10 or 12 years in that other world, which was discovered in our century, in the place where Villegagnon landed. End of quote. As Montaigne comments on how the Tupinambás ceremoniously ate the bodies of their dead enemies, he evaluates cannibalism as a relatively less perverse than some barbarian habits of the 16th century Europe. Although when he wrote his Anthropophagus Manifesto and the subsequent writings on this topic, there were no discussions on transculturality. Andrade's anthropophagy appears today as a powerful proposal for the closest interpenetration of very different cultures, not only establishing a complete equivalent between them, thus confronting all kinds of Eurocentrism, but also claiming for a kind of historical compensation for the harms that Western colonizers inflicted on indigenous population all over the world. And the most important thing for us, researchers in the field of aesthetics and philosophy of art, is that this proposal is underpinned by an aesthetic viewpoint that incorporates social, ethical, and political elements. Thank you.
Thank you, Rodrigo, for the wonderful lecture. I think we can have some questions at the end. And now maybe is someone ready to go? Who is? Who is? Quem é que vai falar agora? Mishko? So, Mishko Suvakovic will do his lecture. Okay. So, welcome, Professor Mishko.
Hello.
So you have the word, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Dobro jutro, bom dia to every friends and colleagues. I'm really happy to give this lecture from the distance, but from one side, I am in Europe with other leg. Now I'm in Brazil with voice. So I will try to discuss some theses important for me and for my last research in the last few years. We will start with the presentation. Sorry. The subject of my lecture is strategies of contemporary art and theory from the avant-garde, neo-avant-garde to the conceptual art to the producing of the politics of time. I will try to speak as a person who had been born in 20th century. I spent 46 years in 20th century, and I spent 23 years in the 21st century. So I'm a person who is some way hybrid between two centuries, between two cultural or model paradigms. And I try to describe and to explain what happened with art and theory of art in the transformations from the 20th to 21st century. What is the difference? How can we point to and interpret this difference between understanding art of the 20th century and art of the 21st century? I start with the term politics of time. Politics time is the politics, how we recognize, how we construct, how we produce and introduce our actions, our thinking, our aesthetic experience in the specific political modes of the time of the past, time of the contemporary, and time of the future. Some theoreticians speak on a history of the future. And for me, as a person born in 20th century, speaking about the 21st century is question about how we can construct the history of the 21st century or the history of future. I start with the terms of French political philosopher Sylvain Lazarus about the sequence. Sequence is a period in which a mode operates. It is the period, short period or long period, when we could find invention of policy or politics, poetics, aesthetics, or theoretization of artistic practices. So my goal is to identify the contradictions and antagonisms that shape contemporary relations between art and society, enriching production, knowing, and surprising reality. So for me, it's very important to see these contradictions, and I use for the starting point two artists. One paradigmatic artist of the 20th century, it is American painter Jackson Pollock, with his idea of the painting as place of existential situation, existential inscription of the traces, his way in which he put his life on the surface of the painting, dancing with the colors, dripping through the surface, constructing new objects. Opposite to him, contemporary artist, Swiss artist, Thomas Hirschhorn, work with quite different situation. He doesn't produce artwork. He produces artistic net of the different situations, like monuments, libraries, relations between humans who live in some parts of the cities, contradictions between two groups or three groups or four groups of antagonistic people who live in the same city or in the same part of the city. He makes some kind of the participatory situation. Pollock offers idea of the new kind of the object. Hirschhorn offers situation which happened and which is the sequence, period of which mode operates between humans without possibility to produce object to put in gallery and museum, only documentation. And this difference between artwork in art world and art situation out of the art world is important for me. But if we return in the past, we can say that 19th century travel or transform in the 20th century through the different modes of interpretation. One dominant mode of interpretation is linearity of the formal changes. We can, in many art histories, in many theories of art and aesthetics, find propositions about transformation from Paul Cézanne and his transforming landscape and human figure in landscape into new mode, which produced Pablo Picasso, Cubist construction or reconstruction of geometrical objects, and how it was constructed the process of the transformation, process of the targeting toward abstraction. So, linear or formal changes in art history mean transformations of the form. Opposite to this idea of the transformation of the form was the idea of the artistic revolutions, concepts of artistic revolutions, new revolutionary concepts of art. We can use and call on the two good examples. It is Kunstismi, book by Hans Arp Lisicki, which speak on artworks or art practice between 1914 to 1924. And opposite to him, Alfred Barr, director of Museum of Modern Art in New York, his idea about the specificity of 20th century art through Cubism and abstract painting. Lisicki and Arp offer idea of artistic revolutions, new modes, new media, new modes of behaving, new modes of presenting and interventing in real life. Alfred Barr offered new modes of the visuality, of spectacularization, how we see through the idea of abstraction. And these two models was dominant, confronting an antagonistic model in the 20th century. But what's happened now? How can we describe this situation? How can we describe this situation when we try to speak what happened in the last 23 years, or 24, or 25? It is transformation of the social situation. We are living in time of social protest. We are living in time in which post-political protests try to break with the dominant neoliberal or autocratic models of governing, yellow vests in France, or protests against violence in Serbia. Second very important transformation is cultural breaks. How we can understand how different cultures put and give them relations. We can speak about phenomenon of immigrants in Europe, Asia, Africa, immigrants between South and North America, but it is the transformation of the life's forms, mixture of life's forms. And from other side, we have some ideas of the canceling, censoring, stopping human traveling and moving with the anti-COVID control before year, 2 years, 3 years. But these relations between body, which is in the expansion, which is in transformation, is very important with this new century. Then we can speak about the artistic turns. Then we can speak about art as participatory art, relation between artist and public, artists and institutions, Tanya Bruguière, between documentations of the human antagonism between civil wars in, for example, in Lebanon in the end of the 20th century, Atlas Group, or new mode of the politicization in virtual space. Who is and what is virtual space? What is the class structure of the virtual space? What is economical structure of virtual space? For example, Slovenian artist Igor Stromayer. Then very important modes in this time is technological transfers. It's mean design between human and machine, between human and different biological modes, human and machine in contemporary design, and between human and biological creatures in bio-art as such. And then we have about aesthetic revolutions, how we change our sensuality, our senses, our possibility of perception, and our body participation in ordinary everyday life. Slovenian group Neue Slowenische Kunst the state in the time and connect people from the different countries on the ground in the time country. Or German photographer Thomas Ruf worked with the recognizing and transformation of the documentary photos from the different modes of distribution in a virtual or internet modes. He used these internet photos and transformed them in abstract construction or abstract representation. But 21st century was in some way determined by social protests, cultural breaks, artistic turn, technological transfers, and cultural and aesthetic revolutions. But how can we reach the 21st century? How can we recognize what's happened in art, international art? I take for discussion one example. It's international exhibition in German in Kassel city, Documenta. This exhibition started in mid-50s as example of the Cold War artistic and cultural production. But in the late 90s, the exhibition Documenta started to transform inner nature. It means the Documenta 10 from 1997, director has been Catherine David, was exhibition devoted to politics. How art became politics. Next Documenta, Documenta 11, Kassel 2002, which was organized by African curator Opui Envezor. It was oriented toward post-colonial politics. What's happened in time when we transform relations between West and South, West and East, North and East, North and South, and how it's happened to the culture and how it's happened in the art, how ex-colonial and ex-colonizational countries became recognized in contemporary art. Question about the power and redistribution power on the global level. Next Documenta 12, 2007, by Roger Burgel and Ruth Noack, was devoted to relations between art and education. Many of artistic practice in last 20 or 30 years happen in art schools. Art schools is parallel system to gallery and museum system. And these curators try to show this close relation between art and educational processes. Documenta 14, Kassel and Aten, 2017, by Polish curator Adam Szymak, was connected with the idea of deterritorialization. What's happened when we have one exhibition, when we have one system of presentation on different geographical, different political and cultural positions? He put this exhibition parallelly in Kassel and Athens. These parallel models show that art is deterritorialized and it is transformed from place for presentation in cultural system for distribution and consumption of art. And Documenta 15, Kassel 2022, 22nd, was curated by Indonesian group Ruang Group, which tried to left art world and to show what happened when ideas of the politics, of the cultural politics, of modes of everyday life on different points on this planet have their activist character. What's happened when we go out of the art world and try to transform artistic practice in cultural practice, activist practice in political practice, artistic practice in epistemological practice. And this line of the transformations from the politics, post-colonial, education, deterritorialization, and activism show how contemporary art in the last 30 years try to find exit from art world, how to go out from the art world. This idea was discussed by many theoreticians in last 20 or more years. As paradigmatic text, I will take text by American aesthetician and art critic Arthur C. Dento. In his text, Art World, published in mid-60s, he discussed idea about the art world. We could not see artwork, we see art world. But what is art world? Art world is contemporary or modern relations between the art object and discourses on art, discourses of art history, theory art, and aesthetics. Art world is some kind of specific context and place for the institutionalization of modern art. American art historian Hal Foster, in his book The Return of the Real, written in the late 80s, wrote about the return of the real. Try how art will find relations, correspondence with the reality, with real life, ordinary life, cultural life, political life, and how can we recognize it in contemporary art, late 80s and 90s. American theoretician Pamela Lee tried to discuss new theses in beginning of the 2000s, leaving, forgetting the art world. Why some artists try to live, try to forgetting the art world? How they forget art world? Why canceling art world? Why everyday life? Why our planet in technological or ecological or political sense became new space for the artistic interventions? And for example, art theoretician and activist Gregory Charlotte, in his book Merciless Aesthetic, tried to speak about art which left cancel relations with the art world, which became some modes, some medium practice of ordinary life and interventions in ordinary life. Second, very important thesis with the discussion on 20th century art is international relations between international and global. International is idea of modernist hegemony of the Paris or New York, and global is some kind of the hybrid map of this planet, mean that many artistic practice have projection of time, history, historism in the spatial sections of our planet. We come from the art practice to ethnography of art, to anthropology of art, to discussion of forms of life on this planet. And then we put relative relations between center and periphery. Periphery in the center. We discuss how artists like Leila Pazoki from Africa discuss Western artists, how Chinese artist Jun Yang discuss transition of the European architecture of modes of life in Chinese contemporary art, or group Slavs and Tatars which work with the Central Asia modes of life, or British artist Anish Kapoor, who produce monuments for the corporative system, neoliberal system of the economic dominance. All of these examples speak of different geography: Africa, Far East, Central Asia, Great Britain. In other sense, we speak about the 20th century as a time of the colonial, post-colonial, and decolonial politics. It's mean In the East Europe, transformation from post-socialism, transition, capitalism to autocracy today, or economic questions about the transformations between economic, political aesthetics, and artistic discussion and pointing to crisis. Some modes of presentation in this century are connected with the popular culture and ideology of populism. It is the modes of reality logic. How politics of populism became mode of artistic presentation, transformation of the artistic transformation of the spectacle in populist event, reality logic. And I make comparison between one Serbian TV show, Survivor with Televizija Nova, Televizija New S, which represents some kind of the reality logic, connected different people on specific location and their specific relation which became public relations, public entertainment. In contrary to it, some artists work with questions about how transform reality logic in the photography or film, Art Club 2000, or work with some kind of the spectacle or spectacular relations with in art, between art world and culture. A. Arakawa. Also, some artists start to produce artworks, art situations, performance, participatory situation, start to work with the complex logic of symptoms, weak relations in social situation. One such artist is Belgrade artist Zoran Todorovic. In his last project, Integration, Illegal People Project 2070, he worked with a refugee center in Belgrade, where refugees from Near East and Africa reside, dwell, and through which they were passing. The urine was collected on the basis on which domestic beer was made according to popular Belgian recipe. In other words, Zoran Todorovic worked with the urine from the refugees, transform urine through the medical and technological process in popular beer in Belgrade or in Great Britain. He worked with this question: what is our body? What is specificity of body? What are the borders? What's happened when body became specific material for production of goods? Or something what is quite opposite to art. It is forms of light beyond art, immigrants' modes of art. We cannot talk about art, but about the distribution of the sensual and about the intensity of affect in the event of life support. And you choose photos from some documentary videos which represent traveling of the immigrants between Africa and Europe, between the Asia and the Balkan. I try to show this, that today we could not make difference between documentary photos, construction complex social project, or the simulations of the artistic and populistic events. Also, one very important model for this century is appropriation of the historical avant-gardes and neo-avant-gardes. How contemporary art appropriate historical neo-avant-gardes from the 50s and 60s. In theoretical sense, it's mean appropriation of analog to digital and from the digital to affective. I chose two examples: the transformations of Namjoon Paik analog works with the video and television into digital installation and digital presentation, or a Japanese performer and activist from the 60s, Yayoi Kusama, which produced live political transgressive events in the middle of the power of United States, today produce paintings, but not she, the robot, which simulate by artificial intelligence her moving, her paintings, her intervention. Today, on the place of artists, of neo-avant-garde, on the place of the analog technology, we have digital logic, digital transformation, and the introducing in the popular, and I will be say, populistic culture. Also, for 21st century is important relations between post-media art, and especially in post-media art mean network art, and how it's happened global circulation of images, how media informations filter, how they transform. In this moment, we are in the middle of post-media art or technology. I gave a lecture from the Belgrade in the Southeast Europe to the Belo Horizonte in Brazil, and it's happened only through the media techniques, media communication, our possibility to understand, to appropriate media as our reality in communication and exchange. And as examples, I show Korean artist Hito Steyer, who work with the circulation of images, or young German artist Florian Kuhlmann, who work with the brand politics. Art looks much better on Instagram. What's happened and where happen things? On the ground, in the buildings, in architecture, or in Instagram? It's important questions with this post-media situation of 21st century. Also, in this century, it is important to speak about relations between human and non-human. From one side, we speak about relations between human, it's mean between human and biological modes or biological forms of life or technological forms of life. Two Slovenian artists, Polona Tratnik, work with in vitro, with the cells, human cells, and their life out of the human bodies. And Maja Smrekar work with relations between technology and wild animals, relations between non-human subjects, how technology and how animals became subjects, creatures or beings with the will, with the power to intervene in reality as such. And all these examples which I try to introduce show this difference between art in the middle of the art world in the 20th century and the art in the 21st century. It is art which go out of the art world, out of the culture in strict sense, which became part of the social struggles and social antagonisms. And on the end of this lecture, I will make comparison between some important concepts in theory of art in 20th century and 21st century. Concept, 20th century, affect, 21st century. Discourse, 20th century, narrative, storytelling, 21st century. Post-production, 20th century, speculative or de-reproduction, 21st century. Human, 20th century, non-human, post-human, 21st century. Action, 20th century, participatory art, 21st century. Ecological, 20th century, eco-ethical, eco-political, 21st century. Urban, 20th century, Geocene, Anthropocene, Capitalocene, 21st century. Disciplinary, 20th century, transdisciplinary, non-disciplinary, 21st century. Image, sound, tactile, 20th century, circulation of aesthetic data impacts 21st century. New media, 20th century, no media 21st century, everything is media, then it is no media. Structuralism, post-structuralism, 20th century, 21st century speculative realism. 20th century philosophy, theory, philosophy. It was war on some way struggle between great Western philosophy and postmodern theory, and return to the philosophy on the end of the 20th century. Today we can speak about the experimental theory and subversive theory. In 20th century theory, on contrary to philosophy, in 21st century theory, art in the field of the market and art in the field of the market economy as apology of market economy or struggle with the market economy. And 20th century idea of the progress, 21st century idea of sustainability. These oppositions for me are in some way dialectical, and it is mean I start this lecture with the theory of the difference and finish with dialectical pressure and dialectical contradictions. Thank you very much.
So now we still have the last lecture from Professor Marilena Chauí. Maybe she's already there.
Eu não sei se eu devo começar ou se tem...
I don't know if I should begin, or is there something,
Yes.
some
please.
announcement or anything?
You have the stage. Please go on.
Thank you. I start apologizing
Eu
for not speaking in English, but my English is not very good. So, and especially talking on philosophy, I prefer to talk in Portuguese. So, I'm sorry. Arte e filosofia no mundo desincorporado.
world. The history of philosophy is marked by a split between sensible and intelligible, subject and object, consciousness and body, and the belief that philosophy and science are the source of meaning, the absolute starting point of thought, and not an original soil and inherence to the world that we need to interrogate. This interrogation leads Merleau-Ponty to consider that we are not pure reflexive consciousness, but a consciousness embodied in a body. Our body, however, is not just the natural thing described by the natural sciences, but a human body that is inhabited and animated by a consciousness. We are not pure thought, for we are a body. We are not a natural thing, for we are a conscience. In addition to the world, as a rational set of scientific facts, there is a world as a place where we live with others and surrounded by things, a qualitative world of colors, sounds, smells, tastes, figures, faces, obstacles, paths. The affective world of people, places, memories, promises, hopes, conflicts. We are temporal beings. We are born and are aware of death. We are cultural beings. We create language, work, society, religion, politics, ethics, arts and sciences, philosophy and arts. What is my body? My body is a visible being among other visible beings, but it has the peculiarity of being a visible seer. I see as well as being seen. Not only that, I can see myself. I am visible to myself, and I can see myself watching. My body is a tactile being like other bodies. It can be touched, but also has the power of touching. It touches and is able to touch itself. My body is sonorous like crystals, like metals. It can be heard, but it also has the power to hear. And more than that, it can make itself heard, and it can be heard when it makes sounds. I hear who speaks to me, but I also hear myself speaking. I am sound to myself. My body is neither a thing nor a machine. It's not a bundle of bones, muscles, and blood, nor a network of causes and effects. It's not a receptacle for a soul or for a conscience. It is my fundamental way of being and being in the world. Sensitive mass segregated in the mass of the sensitive. Our body is mysterious. Trapped in the fabric of the visible, it continues to be seen. Tied to the tangible, it continues to touch itself. Moved in the fabric of movement, it never ceases to move. It suffers from the seen, touched, and moved action it exerts on them. It feels outside from inside and feels from inside its outside. Feeling itself felt, the body reflects. It teaches to conscious what is reflection. It doesn't start from itself. It starts from it. In an astonishing work note from the visible and the invisible, Merleau-Ponty writes, "Being is what creation requires of us, that we may have experience of it." Phrase whose continuation emblematically brings together art and philosophy. As the note continues, I quote it, quote, "Philosophy and art together are not arbitrary fabrications in the universe of culture, but contact with being, precisely as creations." Why creation? Because for the being of the visible to come to visibility, it requires the work of the painter and sculptor. For the being of language to come to expression, it requires the work of the writer and the poet. For the being of sound to come, it requires the work of the musician. For thought to come to intelligibility requires the work of the thinker. If these works are creative, it is precisely because they grope around an intention to express something for which they do not have a model that guarantees them access to being, since it is their action that opens the way of access for the contact by which there can be experience of being. The painter and the sculptor unveil the invisible. The writer and the poet break the silence. The thinker questions the unthought. They carry out a piece of work in which the co-belonging of an inseparable intention and gesture of a subject who is only realized as such because he steps out of himself to expose his practical interiority as a work. But not only that. Creation, as the works of the artists show, is a division within indivision. The experience takes place as that moment in which a visible, the painter's body, becomes visible without leaving visibility, and the painting, without leaving visibility, in which a listener, the musician's body, becomes sonorous without leaving the sonority, and the music, the resonant, becomes audible without leaving sonority, in which a speaker, the poet's body, becomes sayable without it abandoning language, and a sayable thing, the poem, the piece he plays, becomes a speaker without leaving language. The painter brings his body. Indeed, we do not see a spirit, how a spirit could paint, says Valéry, because loaning its body to the world, the painter transforms the world into a painting. Painting is the transubstantiation between the body of the painter and the sculptor and the body of things. How is that possible? The vision and movement are inseparable, although different. To see is not to appropriate the world in image, but to approach things, to have them, but from a distance. Moving is not carrying out commands that the soul sends to the body, but the imminent result of the maturation of a vision. Our body is a seer and driving power that sees because it moves, and moves because it sees. But why is there transubstantiation between our body and the world? Because we and the world are made of the same stuff, and between it and us there is transitivism, crossing, mating, in which traits, figures, sounds, colors, gestures mate with their incorporeal meaning. In fact, the presence of things is a mystery, because they claim existence as individuals, and can only exist if they are more or less than individuals. More, they are fields or configurations, families or styles of being, the family of colors, odors, the family of sounds. Less, they are pure differentiations. A color is pure differentiation between colors, not a thing, a colored atom. A luminous wave endowed with identity. A sound is pure difference between sounds, not a sound wave endowed with identity. A texture, stone, wood, metal, is pure difference between textures and not a physical chemical identity. Things intertwine and intersect. The surface intertwines and intersects with colors and sounds that intertwine and intersect with odors and textures that intertwine and intersect in endless movements, in an incessant exchange in which each one is discernible because it belongs to a different family. But each one is also indistinguishable from the others because together they form the tight and porous fabric of the world. Our body, a sensitive thing among things, is sensitive to itself. It is the one that makes us see things in the place where they are, and according to their desires, fulfilling the mystery of seeing and touching. Vision and touch have the gift of ubiquity. Vision is effected simultaneously from things and from the eyes. Touch occurs simultaneously from things and hands. Our senses operate through transitivity, intertwining like things. The look feels, the hands see, the eyes move with touch. Touch sustains our mobility, and our mobility compensating immobility and mobility of things. Thus, the artist unveils the mystery of things and of the body, because he reveals the body as a wandering sensitive, a sensitive among sensitives, and a concentrated sensitive, a sensitive that feels and is sensitive to himself. The artist's work destroys the metaphysical distinction between passivity and activity, unveiling them as simultaneous and indistinguishable. What does art teach philosophy? It teaches that the body reflects, and that reflection is not a privilege or exclusiveness of consciousness. Thanks to the work of art, we discover that reflection is not a privilege of consciousness nor the essence of consciousness, but it collects an older reflection that teaches it to reflect, body reflection. However, art teaches much more, because the artist's work reveals that bodily reflection is neither full possession of oneself nor full identity of the body with itself, but an inherence and confusion with itself and with things. This discovery teaches philosophy where there is the impossibility for consciousness to carry out a complete reflection and be the intellectual possession of itself and the world. The visible, the tactile, the sonorous, the moving are mysterious. Painting, sculpture, music, theater, dance, cinema unravel these mysteries because they realize the visible, the tactile, the sound, and the moving by transfiguring them into meanings. Through the mating of the sensitive and the intelligible, that is, through the mediation of the body. Painting and sculpture, music and dance make us discover that the body is mysterious. Trapped in the fabric of the visible, it continues to be seen. Tied to the tangible, it continues to touch itself. Driven in the fabric of movement, it never ceases to move. It suffers from the seen, touched, and moved action it exerts on them. It feels from outside its inside, and feels from outside its inside. Like the visible, language is also mysterious. In a way, language only has to do with itself. In inner monologue, as in dialogue, there are no thoughts. There are words that words evoke. And as far as that we think more fully, words fill so precisely our spirit that they don't leave an empty corner for pure thoughts and for meanings that aren't language. The mystery is that in the very moment when language is thus obsessed with itself, it is able, as if by excess, to open us up to meaning. This is the mystery of literature. In an instant, the flow of words cancels itself out as noise, throws us full on what we want to say, And if we respond, it's still in words, unintentionally. We don't think of the words that we say that tell us. We don't think of the hand that we squeeze. There's a unique meaning to language. The more evident, the more we surrender to it. The less equivocal, the less we think about it. Rebellious to any direct capture, but docile to the enchantment of language, always there when we address it to evoke it, but always a little further away from the point where we believe we grasp it. Sound and signal. Language is mystery because it makes meanings present. It transgresses sound and graphic materiality. It invades immateriality, and glorious and impalpable glory couples with the invisible. It's not an instrument to translate silent meanings. It is inhabited by them. It is not a means to arrive at something, but a way of being. More than that, a being in itself. Sense is not something that would pre-exist the word, but the total movement of speech, and that is why our thought wanders through language. When we surrender to it, meaning comes. When we want to grab it, without it, it never comes. But how does language signify? Indirectly and elusively. It does not designate a meaning. It makes it present through signs, but always on a primordial and inexhaustible background of silence. It is because it is indirect and elusive, an open and mobile totality on an inner background of silence, that the word is expressive. I quote Merleau-Ponty, means when, instead of copying thought, one lets oneself be made and remade by it. End of quotation. However, what language is this, where they exist only when we don't reduce to a mere designation of things, a mere copy of thinking, of thoughts? It is not empirical language of our everyday language established by our culture. It is the creative language, operative, institutive. It describes language of the poet, of the theater and the sinner. When they give a torsion on the existing language, they steal the balance to make it signify and mean what is new. The mystery of language is that it only expresses when it is forgotten as language, and it only allows itself to be forgotten when it succeeds in expressing. The glorious strength of language lies exactly in its power to hide its operations from us, like the weaver that only lets us see the right side of the tapestry, although this only exists thanks to the work done on the reverse side. The triumph of language is that of making us believe, at the end of a book, that we are communicating with the author from spirit to spirit, without words. The question, what does art teach philosophy? Our answer is that art teaches philosophy the mating of the sensible and the intelligible, the materiality of bodies and the immateriality of meaning through the mediation of our body as a spatial and temporal reflection, as an open sensibility that goes beyond itself in creation. Dance is certainly the greatest expression of this, when sound, movement, and meaning are fused into bodies that teach us what weight and lightness, action and paralysis, pain and joy, contact and solitude, in short, the pure gesture as fullness of meaning. If this is the ontological teaching that art brings to philosophy. What happens when our body undergoes an unprecedented mutation with the emergence of the virtual world? In the postmodern condition, David Harvey points out, as a consequence of the new form of capital accumulation, that is, neoliberalism, an unprecedented transformation in our experience of space and time, designated by him as space-time compression. In fact, the fragmentation and globalization of economic production engender two opposite and simultaneous phenomena. On the one hand, the fragmentation and spatial and temporal dispersion of production, with the end of great industrial plants, and on the other, under the effects of electronic technologies and of information, the compression of space. Everything happens here, without distances, differences, or borders. And the compression of time. Everything happens now, without a past and without a future. As Paul Virilio says in this critical space, from the topological space of our bodily experience, we pass to atopy. That is, to the absence of spatial reference, and from the differentiation of oneself with oneself that defines lived time, we pass to achrony, that is, the absence of temporal reference. Volatile and ephemeral, today our experience does not know any sense of continuity and is exhausted in a present, reduced to a fleeting instant, without past and without future. We live under the sign of telepresence and teleobservation, in which everything seems to be immediately given to us in the form of transparent images presented as evidence. We can thus say there is another world, the virtual world, devoid of temporal and spatial thickness, in which our body is reduced on the one hand to the visual perception of flat and fleeting images, and on the other to the mechanical activity of control of operations and signals proposed by the automata. The world without places, distances, depth, qualities. The world of atopy. A world without time, in which nothing passes and nothing remains, as everything coexists without a past and without a future, in an endless, the world of achrony. What does virtual mean? In the philosophical tradition, the possible is what can come into existence if there is an agent or circumstances that make it come into existence. The real is what actually exists, the possible what can come to exist. Also, in the philosophical tradition, there is a tendency to identify the possible and the virtual. The seed is the virtual tree or the possible tree. That is, the possible and the virtual were considered as latent potentialities that could come into existence. From the point of view of tradition, an expression such as virtual reality is nonsense, because the virtual is unreal. It's a mere possible that does not yet exist. The computer and cybernetic revolutions, however, changed the concept of virtual. Virtual is already real and already exists. It's not opposed to actual or real, but to the current. Virtual.
I imagine that in English it's complicated. The difference between actual and reality, because it's the same word. I hope that my explanation is clear. I'm back to my text. So, a revolução informática e a cibernética, porém, modificaram.
Revolutions, however, changed the concept of virtual. The virtual is already real and already exists. It's not opposed to the actual, but to the current. Virtual is understood as something real and existing that awaits an update and that can be infinitely updated. The virtual is what cannot be determined by spatial and temporal coordinates, as it exists without being present in a specific space or time. That is, atopy, acrony are its own mode of existence. In the virtual world, updating is, in the virtual world, updating is the relationship between human individuals and information systems. Virtualization dispenses that has always been at the core of human experience, presence. In their place, communication networks or coordination processes operate their own spatiality and temporality, that is atopic and achronic. With the virtual comes the so-called cyberculture as a set of digital codes, a potential of images that forms cyberspace, that establishes a style of relationship independent of geographic and topographical places, atopy, and the coincidence of times always in the mode of the presence, achrony. Coincidence of times, or time owned just like now, and universal space, or space with here, like here. These two characteristics of the virtual world mean, after all, an unlimited process of disappearance of the reference to our corporal existence, space and time, heading towards the disembodiment of human beings and the perceptual world. Therefore, it is not surprising that many of the creators and defenders of cyberspace refer to it significantly as a disembodied and spiritual space, a possibility, according to some, of transforming ourselves into beings of pure light, free from the brutality and chaos typical of our bodies, freed from space and time, new angels of a new terrestrial paradise in which, of course, there will be no death, because we can download our minds to computers and, transcending materiality, live forever in digital space. Hence, a first philosophical question: what can art be in a world without bodies, without space, and without time? How to preserve the idea that art teaches philosophically the coupling of the sensible and the intelligible through the act of creation, bringing a new meaning to the world through the mediation of bodily reflection. There is still another question. What subjectivity is born from virtual unreality? Subjectivity is no longer considered reflection and questioning, being reduced to narcissistic intimacy. And objectivity is not the knowledge of what is exterior and different from the subject, but rather a set of strategies mounted on language games that represent thought games, without knowledge ever facing reality as an experience that raises questions. This new subjectivity is no longer defined by the body's relations with the space and time, the time of the world or of life, but with the complexity of sparse and fragmented reticular relationships. These new technologies operate with obedience and seduction in the mental field. However, they are disguised in an alleged freedom to choose to obey, because studies in neurology reveal that in users there is a decrease in the capacities of the frontal lobe of the brain, where thinking and judgments take place, and there is a great development of part of the brain responsible for desire. People think less and want more, and the companies develop applications to emphasize, direct, induce, and stimulate desires. Now, to exist is to be seen. Thus, the new subjectivity is marked by two traits that are apparently contrary, but actually complementary. On the one hand, a depressive subjectivity, because marked by the need to win any and all competitions, and by guilt if you fail. And on the other hand, a narcissistic subjectivity produced by the practices of electronic communication technologies. We say that only in appearance do these two forms of subjectivity seem contrary, since more than a century ago, Freud's studies revealed that depression and narcissism are two sides of the same coin. Can the arts teach us to undo this phantasmagoria? Thank you very much.
So, we do have time for a few questions and a little discussion before lunch, but I have some informations to you. Those who don't know that this little beautiful bag is our lunch, content our lunch sticks, so keep it and use it in the restaurant. The restaurant is outside the building, so we should go out and left to the service square. So Rodrigo told me that maybe we should do some questions to Misku and Marilena because they are not here, and he will be around. So let me go there. Ah, você vai lá da praia?
Thank you. Aleksandra Łukaszewicz from Poland. I have got the question to the last presentation to Marlena. I hope that somebody can translate to her, because I was quite challenged by the presentation and I find it a kind of traditional, too traditional, and I wonder how to refer it a bit differently maybe to the contemporary world. Marlena, wherever you are, you were talking about this, that yes, the painter has to have a body and is bringing it to the world, as Merleau-Ponty was writing about the Cézanne. So what you can tell about, for example, AI software creating images or painting? And there are a few options. For example, maybe you consider that they have a body, though a kind of different body, not physical, but digital body. Or maybe you think that they are not painters or not creators of images, although they are creating images, or maybe some would agree that they are painting. This would entail that creating images or painting, it is not enough to be recognized as a painter or creator of images. Or maybe you are thinking that they are generally not painting, but creating another kind of images. And generally, so this is one thing. And another, you were talking about the virtual world as a kind of disembodied, flat. You use this word, that it is flat. And I wonder if you, for example, experience some artworks in virtual art museums that are interactive, and you feel it interact with your body, with the speaking, with the sound, and you are moving around the space, and it is, developing. So generally, experiencing artworks in the virtual world is a very sensible experience. It is not just visual, it is kinesthetic, it is tactile, it is involving also this audio side, with the speaking and hearing and so forth. So generally, I wouldn't agree that virtual world is disembodied. And if I have to, I would say that yes, it is first disembodied and then re-embodied in a different way. So then we are kind of not losing the bodies, but transforming the form of embodiment. Thank you.
Well, may I answer?
Please.
Ok. Gabi, desapareceram os outros. Well, let me tell you, I'm very happy that you are so full of hope, because I'm not. I am an old woman from a very old world, so I'm not prepared to this. I think I don't want to be as Plato, that said when he saw the written word that it would be the end of thought, because no memory and no dialogue would be possible. I'm not as the medieval monks when the Gutenberg created the print, that lecture would be impossible because it was a collective event, and it would become a very individual and solitude situation, no discussion, etc. I don't believe that, as many said, that the movies would kill theater, or that movies and theater would be killed by television, and that television would be killed by all this virtual world. No, I'm not conservative. What I'm saying is, this world, the world of the algorithm, the world of the virtual, the world that operates without the references of topology and time, is a world in which art cannot be what they were. At the same time, I think that a world without space and time is irreality. So my question wasn't what to do and to feel without hope. What I asked is, what art will teach us about this new this fantastic, phantasmagoric world of the virtual? I'm not saying that art is finished, not at all. We are seeing that it's not finished, but it's not what we used to think that art would be. So my question is a very, very real one. I'm not irrealistic, but I think that the virtual world is not a gift from the gods. It's the Silicon Valley. It's capitalism. It's the power of capital. So we are not talking about a fantastic, wonderful new world, unless we are Huxley. And then it's a new world. So I think I didn't do that in my speech because I didn't want to be too long. I want to be very short to give time to the others. So all this that I did, that I talked, everything has an economic and political basis that I didn't put for you. So we can discuss this in another time if you want, but let's give the name to the things. It's an economic change with political consequences, psychological consequences, scientific consequences, and artistic consequences. So to me, it's a word very, very oppressive. And people believe that it's a word of freedom. And I don't think so it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra, for your question too. Maybe someone want to talk with Miško also, put some questions to him, so that you could be equal.
Sorry, so this question is to Miško. Hello, I'm Fiona Hughes from University of Essex in England. I want to ask how you see the situation of the untimely, the out of step, in these different periods. So the untimely in the Nietzschean sense of the unzeitmäßige artwork, because you set up a series of contrasts which are extremely interesting and productive. But what happens to what falls out of the set of distinctions? How do artists operate when they don't belong to the dominant paradigm, or they don't even specifically respond to the dominant paradigm? Is that different between the 20th century and the 21st century? Is there a place for the out of step, the out of time in both centuries?
Thank you for the question. In some way, it's some central question of my presentation. And my idea was that many of things which happen in 21st century, of course, come from the 20th century, come from that time, but with very deep transformation, very deep transformation. And this deep transformation happened with the disappearance, real disappearance of artistic products, which became part of the social processes or social situations or social events. It means that many artists start to use not specific artistic medium for production artwork, painting, video, DVD, digital or cyber technology. They use many different situations, but dominantly they work with the forms of life. And for me, it's the most biggest difference. Some artists lost reference with the production of the finished artwork, which will be presented in the system of arts. Some artists stop to interest in art world, in sense that they start to work with one side scientific laboratories, from other side with some kind of the activist school for the child, restaurants, ordinary life and intervention in ecological or technological space. In that sense, they don't work on the level who have target artistic product. It have artistic intervention, but in one moment, some artists start to cancel their production and their artistic roots and relations. For example, Belarusian artist Marina Naprushkina started to work in the beginning of 2000s in relation and criticize Belarusian government. She produced artwork with parolas, with interventions. But now she works in Berlin suburbs, and organize primary schools for the children of immigrants. She said that her work today start in artwork context, but now lost relation with this. For example, for me is the most drastic model, which I try to present now. It means that art doesn't exist more, but it changed fundamentally character, especially functions. It means that art is connected with a specific situation in politics, economy, and modes of production. Because today, economy, politics, and modes of productions are not connected with specific stable system. Now, governments on all this planet, Serbian or British government, look more than corporative systems than political institutions from alignment times. This idea that we lost characteristic modern context and that you try to find new context, sometimes wrong, sometimes great, it is connected and important for this kind of art. And also from the earlier discussion, I don't see big difference between virtual and physical world. Both worlds are real in political and cultural sense for our modes of the life. I don't know if I answered on your question, but it was my central idea.
So, last question, maybe. Over there.
Okay, George Clark from Peru. In this comparative study from the 20th and 21st century art, you did not include beauty, which I found surprising. I imagine that beauty was very important until the 19th century and partially not important in the 20th century, and I think has been banned from the 21st century in art. So the question is, where would you put beauty in this analysis? And is there a place for beauty in the 21st century art? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. It's very important aesthetical question about what's happened with the beauty. But in the 18th century, early 19th century, beauty was the central subject, for example, for artistic schools. In the end of the 20th century, central question in artistic schools has been questions of the critical, subversive, and transgressive, very far from the beauty. In 21st century, you could find some books, some magazines, some exhibition with transformation of the concept of beauty, not in directions to the sublime, but to direction to cute, to the questions to the questions of the populist culture, how beauty became part of the populist culture. And for me, this idea of the beauty as part of the populist culture, the question of the market distribution of the senses and sensual in this world, but in the context, in the interest of the capital, is important.
So we are finished this session. So the last one.
I am Flávio Cotti from the University of Brasilia. I'm not traveling, working anymore, but I want to make you another question. It's something like a geopolitical question. No? You have tried to define with concepts what is the tendency of art in the 21st century. And we need to wait till it happens. Perhaps we will have something very different of that. We have a change in the world. Normally in Europe, they don't discuss the dominance of America on Europe and the changing that are happening nowadays that define also the role of art in the dominance in the world. The digital war that we have every day in our television and in our universities and our minds. How can you see that very concretely from your point of view?
Yeah. In my earlier book, 3E, I tried to discuss the relation between two different relations toward the digital media and post-media. First idea is that digital media produce any kind of the truthful image. It means it is post-truth concept. You can, by digitally produce or simulate any kind of the truth, any kind of the narrative. And from opposite to it, every digital system is included in real life. It is for me diri media. It's mean relation of digital and human body, human nature, urban space. It's mean that the digital is not separate from the political, economical models. And it is a basic question of globalization. What is in reality globalization on this planet in this moment? It's mean two aspects. One is Western mode of the technology, dominant technology, but this technology is not now only Western, it is also Chinese, it's also Indonesian, it's also Indian, it's also Russian toward American models. And from other side, you have local narratives. For me, this combination of the universality of the digital production or speculation toward specificity of local narratives is one of the main characteristics of the notion of the global. Global is not just internationalization. In the end of the 19th century, you have dominance of French culture. In the mid-20th century, you have dominance of American culture in Europe. But it doesn't mean this moment you have not such simple model of center and influence. You have some central global technology and different, very local, very specific narratives connected with the local cultures and geopolitical identities. It was a reason why last summer happened scandal with the German exhibition Documenta 15, when curators from Indonesia produce quite different image of the relations between dominant and marginal, not only in art, but also in culture and especially in politics, different from the European standards and ideas. So, but it is not different medium, it's different content and different identity and mode of usage of media. So I think that we have to discuss how happened these correlations between universality of speculative digital media and specific local or paralocal narratives. Because today in Europe, local is not third world is not just somewhere in Asia, Africa, South America. It is the middle of the European cities. And it is very complex situation, and we need to understand and to criticize this context as such.
So we are now finishing our main session. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. Thank you very much, Misko Subarkovic.
Thank you.
And Marilena Shawi also is still there with us. Thank you very much for your presence. And now we can have our lunch. You want to give us some words? It's okay. So see each other in the restaurant.
Bye-bye, and happy with the Congress.
Bye.